Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. We do want to encourage folks to participate by using the chat window there. Feel free to kind of pose any questions that you might have about the presentation or the data. Someone from our team here will be monitoring the chat, as well as Joe when he's available to try to address questions as we go along as well. But first, I just want to welcome you all, and thank you so much for joining us today for another installment of the research webinar series hosted by our team here at the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, or MVLRI. The goal of MVLRI is to expand Michigan's capacity to support new learning models, engage in active research to inform new policies in online and blended learning, and strengthen the state's infrastructures for sharing best practices. MVLRI is a division of MVU, or the Michigan Virtual University, a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing K-12 education through digital learning, research, innovation, policy, and partnerships. MVU also provides a student learning services for K-12 students through the Michigan Virtual School, as well as professional development opportunities in blended and online learning through its Professional Learning Services division. Just a quick disclaimer before we get started today. This webinar will be recorded and shared publicly. Consequently, anything shared during this webinar, including chat comments, could be shared publicly. This webinar may represent a presenter's or an attendee's personal views, opinions, conclusions, and other information which do not necessarily reflect those of MVU and or the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute and are not given nor endorsed by MVU/MVLRI unless otherwise specified. That probably doesn't apply too much today since our presenter is Dr. Joe Friedoff, the Vice President here at Michigan Virtual University, who I'll hand it off to now. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, thank you so much, Justin. Appreciate the introduction there. Very happy to be with all of you here. Christopher from Vancouver, thank you for coming and attending this webinar. This is, I think, the fourth year we've done this report, 6 years of data, and always one of the more exciting things that I get to do at my work here at MVU. And very excited to spend roughly an hour here kind of highlighting some of the best findings that we have for you. Really, the purpose of this presentation is to highlight some of the key findings from our recently released Michigan's K-12 Virtual Learning Effectiveness Report for the 2015-16 school year. My goal in the brief time that we have together is really to communicate the key trends and statistics that we observed when looking at the statewide virtual learning data for the 2015-16 school year. It's my hope that these findings help the practitioners among us to ask new and important questions when evaluating your virtual learning programs. And for those of you researchers in attendance, I really hope that some of the findings spark areas of new inquiry. Let's begin by talking a little bit about where the data for this report came from. The primary data for this report came from the 2015-16 collection year of the Michigan Student Data System's Teacher-Student Data Links. It's the big repository that the schools report their data to. In this collection, the student course component includes a field that's called Virtual Method for each enrollment that's reported to the state. The Virtual Method field has 4 values to choose from. Those 4 include blended learning, digital learning, not virtual, or an online course. So those 4. And 99% of the virtual enrollments identified in this report were due to the virtual method flag being set to one of those 3 virtual options. The remaining 1% of the enrollments came from searches of enrollments in the TSDL that had a virtual method that was recorded as not virtual, but that had a local course title that suggested the virtual method, that value was likely incorrect. So for example, a search of the local course titles were done to look for references about the Michigan Virtual School or other common third-party providers, as well as general references to online or virtual. To point out the obvious, there are likely enrollments included in this report that are counted as being delivered virtually that were not, either because of local course title search process mentioned just earlier or because of a mistake in coding by the school. Consequently, the figures in this report should be treated as estimates that, generally speaking, convey the trends observed for the 2015-16 school year. Unlike in previous years for this report, data on most virtual learners was not available due to changes in reporting requirements for the TSDL. So beginning in the 2015-16 reporting cycle, districts only needed to report TSDL data on students if they fit into one or more of 5 categories. Those categories were migrant education participants at grades 9 through 12, dual enrollment, grades 9 through 12, early middle college participants 9 through 12, advanced and accelerated learning participants, all grades, and this is the AP students or IB students, as well as then the virtual or online learning participants. This change appears to have had an impact on the reporting of virtual enrollments. As evidence, consider that there were 267 schools that reported virtual enrollments in 2014-15 that did not report any virtual enrollments in the 15-16 year. That's not really surprising, but even after discarding schools that reported less than 100 virtual enrollments for 2014-15, there were still 74 schools with a large number of enrollments in 2014-15 that reported no virtual enrollments in 2015-16. Those 74 schools had close to 60,000 virtual enrollments in 24-15. And it doesn't seem plausible to assume that every one of those 74 schools stopped offering virtual enrollments when there were such sizable programs the prior year. It seems more plausible to me to conclude that at least some of them had virtual enrollments that went unreported. This change in reporting requirements should be kept in mind when comparing virtual enrollment numbers with those recorded in earlier years. In the 2015-16 TSDL collection, there were 11 different statuses to choose from when declaring the final completion status for an enrollment. Only one of those, completed and passed, represents that the student both finished the course and met the minimum expectations for passing the course. Examples of the other 10 statuses include things like audited, testing out, completed but failed, withdrawn failed, and even withdrawn passing. As is likely evident, if some of those statuses were excluded, say for instance the audited enrollments or even the withdrawn passing, well, the virtual pass rates that we were reporting would change. But given the data this year and in past years, the impact of such exclusions would be fairly minimal, likely only a few percentage points. So this report continues to use the same formula for calculating the virtual pass rate as we have in the previous three reports, where it's the percentage of the completed pass divided by the percentage of all completion statuses. This report is organized into several sections. This is a little bit different in how we organize it this year. The first section looks at schools as the unit of analysis. The next section focuses on the virtual courses that those are taken in those schools. The third section is really focused on students. And there's also a brief section containing maps of the virtual usage in the state. Each section is meant to capture the essential findings without being overly data intensive. However, the data tables have been included in the appendices of this year's report to really provide those who are interested with more in-depth information. All right, well, let's move on to talking about some of the key findings, starting with schools. For the 2015-16 school year, 570 districts reported having at least one virtual enrollment. This represents approximately 63% of Michigan public school districts. Within those districts, 1,026 schools reported having at least one virtual enrollment, and collectively, those schools produced more than 453,000 virtual enrollments. Just over half of schools with virtual enrollments, and 52 to be precise, had 100 or more virtual enrollments. As has been observed in previous years, schools with less than 10 virtual enrollments were the next highest percentage of schools with 16%. However, those schools only generate 0.1% of the virtual enrollments. 73% of schools with virtual enrollments had a general education school emphasis. 25% had an alternative education emphasis. Schools designated with general education as their emphasis produced 65% of the virtual enrollments in the state, whereas the alternative education schools accounted for 33% of the virtual enrollments in Michigan. LEAs, local education agencies, and PSAs, public school academies, generated close to 90% of all of the virtual enrollments. The LEAs accounted for 54% and the PSAs accounted for 44%. Almost 900 or 88% of school buildings with virtual enrollments came from LEA schools, while only 91 or 9% of the schools were from PSAs. Of the 44 full-time virtual buildings, 33 of them were LEA schools. Those 33 schools totaled over 18,000 virtual enrollments. In contrast, the 11 PSA cyber schools had over 148,500 virtual enrollments. This means that PSA cyber schools were responsible for a third of the virtual enrollments, and in total, 37% of virtual enrollments came from cyber or full-time virtual schools. 97% of the more than 453,000 virtual enrollments came from schools with 100 or more virtual enrollments. Virtual enrollments tended to be concentrated at the high school level. Students in 12th grade enrolled in the most virtual courses, representing approximately 26% of all the virtual enrollments. Grades 4, 5, and 6 all had more than 10,000 virtual enrollments, and both second and third grades were close to reaching that 10,000 enrollment level. Rural schools represented about 36% of schools with virtual enrollments. Suburban schools accounted for the second largest chunk of schools, but the suburban schools tallied the largest percentage of virtual enrollments at 28%. Schools that were missing a locale designation, which was about 25% of the schools, and city schools, which is about 24%, were other locales with more than 100,000 virtual enrollments. The lack of locale codes for schools was really due to a change in how the National Center for Educational Statistics, NCES, how their process for determining the locale codes. The locale code updates were not available until late 2016. Therefore, those updates were not available for the timing of this report. In each of the 4 locales, rural, town, suburban, city, schools with 100 or more enrollments accounted for the largest percentage of schools, and similarly, schools with less than 25 virtual enrollments was the second most likely scenario. About 28% of schools with virtual learning had school-wide pass rates of 90 to 100%. Over half had virtual pass rates of 70% or better. The percentage of schools with an overall virtual pass rate of less than 10% dropped from 9 to 5%. Generally speaking, LEA schools and PSA schools had approximately the same virtual pass rate, 58 compared to 57, though there was a notable difference in the full-time virtual schools, where LEA full-time programs had a 65% pass rate compared to a 51% pass rate for PSA cyber schools. There was also a considerable difference in the pass rates between general education and alternative education schools. Gen Ed schools had a 62% pass rate, whereas alternative education schools had a 49% pass rate, though this varied by entity type. LEA schools, for instance, had a 68% virtual pass rate for Gen Ed schools and a 46% pass rate for alternative education schools. From a grade level perspective, kindergarten had the highest virtual pass rate at 70%. Ninth grade was the lowest at 45%. Virtual pass rates also varied by locale, where town schools had a virtual pass rate of 70% compared to only 50% for city schools. In general, schools with fewer virtual enrollments per student performed better. Consider, for instance, that 37% of schools with an average of 1 to 2 virtual enrollments per virtual learner had a virtual pass rate of 90 to 100%, whereas only 20% of schools with an average of 3 to 4 virtual courses per learner had a 90 to 100% pass rate. Chris, pass rates were calculated by taking the students who had final completion status of completed pass divided by the total number of enrollments. So out of those 12 different statuses that they could have, 12 or 11 different statuses, we counted it as a success if they had completed and passed. We counted that over everything else. Let me see. So in line with findings from previous years, virtual learners passed their virtual courses at a lower rate, 58%, than they passed their non-virtual courses, which was 78%. This gap of 20% is about 7% larger than the 2014-15 school year. Now that we know a little bit more about the data from the school perspective, let's shift our focus to the course level. Michigan's K-12 students accounted for more than 453,000 virtual enrollments. These enrollments were spread across 871 different course titles, and that is done according to the SCED codes that the NCES puts out, rather than the local course titles that each school would call them. The overall virtual pass rate for the 453,000 plus courses was 58%. Close to 70% of virtual enrollments came from the course subjects. English Language Arts was the subject area with the highest virtual enrollment, exceeding 91,000 enrollments, or 20% of all virtual enrollments. English 9, 10, 11, 12 were the most highly enrolled in titles for this subject area. The overall virtual pass rate for ELA was 54%. For the 4 most highly enrolled in ELA courses, the virtual pass rate ranged from a low of 42% in 9th grade ELA to a high of 63% in 12th grade ELA. Mathematics had over 75,000 virtual enrollments, or more than 17% of the enrollments. Geometry, Algebra 2, Algebra 1, Consumer Math, those were the virtual courses with the highest enrollments. The overall virtual pass rate for math was 52%, and the pass rate across the 10 most enrolled in virtual mathematics courses was only 49%. This ranged from a low of 33% for Algebra 1 Part 1, that's a course where you can take Algebra 1 over 2 years, to a high of 65% for both Consumer Math and General Math. Life and Physical Sciences had over 63,000 virtual enrollments, or about 14% of the enrollments. Biology, Chemistry, and Earth Science were the 3 course titles responsible for more than 10% of the virtual enrollments in this subject area. A quarter of all life and physical science virtual courses were taken in biology. The overall virtual pass rate for life and physical science was 57%, and of the top 10 titles, biology and earth science had the lowest pass rates at 49%. The highest was science from grade 7, which had a pass rate of 70%. Finally, social sciences and history had over 77,000 virtual enrollments, or about 17% of the enrollments. 3 course titles, U.S. History, World History, and Economics, each yielded more than 10% of the virtual enrollments. The overall virtual pass rate for social sciences and history was 59%. Pass rates for the top 10 most enrolled in courses range from a low of 34 for early U.S. history to a high of 80% for sociology. For each of the 4 core subjects shown on this slide, and for many other subjects as well, the virtual pass rates were consistently lower than the non-virtual pass rates for the virtual learners in their non-virtual courses. This is a trend that has continued from the past years. Yes. Yep. The reason we didn't talk about it, Chris, in this particular point is because it was about 80% of the data are around the things in the core. But yes, the report does have data on all of them, including a variety of elective courses. 29 AP courses were taken in 2015-16. AP Psych was the most popular course, accounting for 16% of the more than 2,300 AP enrollments. The pass rate for AP courses taken virtually was 85%, so quite a bit higher than just the average. But the pass rate for non-virtual AP courses taken by those virtual learners was 93%. Enrollment patterns were fairly consistent across locales. For instance, mathematics represented between 16% and 18% of virtual enrollments for all 4 locales. The range was also 2% between 13 and 15% for life and physical sciences. The biggest difference in percentage of enrollments was in ELA, where city schools had about 24% of their virtual enrollments, where in contrast it was just 18% for suburban schools and 16% for both rural and town schools. Pass rates in virtual courses also varied across subject areas and locales. For instance, in ELA, pass rates fell between 49% for city schools to 66% for town schools. And in mathematics, pass rates range from 49% in city schools to 63% in the towns. As mentioned earlier, schools classified the virtual courses into one of three types: blended learning, digital learning, or online learning. It may be helpful to understand how these were defined according to the Michigan Student Data Collection Systems Manual for the 2015-16 school year. Blended learning was defined as a hybrid instructional delivery model where pupils are provided content, instruction, and assessment at a supervised educational facility where the pupil and teacher are in the same physical location, and in part through internet-connected learning environments with some degree of pupil control over time, location, and pace of instruction. For a course to be considered blended, at least 30% of the course content is delivered online. Digital learning was defined as a course of study that is capable of generating a credit or a grade that is provided in an interactive, internet-connected learning environment that does not contain an instructor, that's the key part, within the online environment itself. There may be a teacher of record assigned to the course, but this teacher does not provide instruction to students through the online environment. For a course to be considered online as opposed to blended, all or almost all the course content is delivered online. And finally, the definition of the online course is a course of study that's capable of generating a credit or grade that's provided in an interactive, internet-connected learning environment where pupils are separated from their teachers by time or location or both, and for a course to be considered online as opposed to blended, all or almost all the course content is delivered online. Blended learning accounted for about 11% of the virtual enrollments and had a pass rate of 80%. Digital learning totaled 10% of the enrollments with a 55% pass rate, and online courses represented the majority, 79% of virtual enrollments, and yielded a pass rate of 55%. Just going to check the chat because I know there was a couple of questions coming through there. The question is there a high level of variability between courses that could potentially be coded in the same way? Yes, I'm sure there is. Schools aren't provided with a ton of training about how to enter this information into the statewide data systems. However, the state does have and does leverage the NCES SCED codes that we mentioned before, which means it doesn't really matter what they call the local title. They're going to link that local title to a consistent catalog. So they may call it Intro to Algebra, but in the NCES they would map it to something that might say Pre-Algebra. And so that's one of the ways we have consistencies across titles, but there could also be variations in what counts as a pass and other factors. Even things where people might call something blended that somebody else would not say is blended, something that's an online course that's digital. So there are a lot of areas where people are making judgment calls. Okay. We now have a fairly in-depth picture of virtual learning from the course perspective. Let's shift our focus again, this time turning our attention to students as the level of analysis. For the 2015-16 school year, just under 91,000 Michigan K-12 students, or approximately 6% of students in the state, took at least one virtual course. This was slightly lower than the number of virtual learners reported in the 2014-15 school year, which was 91,261. Only about 6% of the state's virtual learners were in grades K-5. Grades 6-8 were responsible for about 8% of the virtual learners. High school generated 87% of the virtual learners. Over 30% of virtual learners were high school seniors, and more than 20% were juniors. 1/2 of virtual learners passed every virtual enrollment they took. 1/4 did not pass any of the virtual enrollments, and 26% passed some, but not all of their virtual courses. Students who passed all of their virtual courses were responsible for 35% of the virtual enrollments. Students with mixed success generated 45% of the enrollments, and students who did not pass any of their virtual courses contributed 21% of the virtual enrollments. For the students who did not pass any of their virtual courses, 50% only took 1 or 2 courses, which that's a pretty good deal. On the other hand, over 78,000 students took 5 or more virtual courses, and a staggering 2,328 students did not pass 11 or more virtual courses. Almost 1,500 of those students, or 64% of those students, had enrollments with cyber or full-time virtual programs. Approximately 20% of virtual learners attended a PSA cyber school or a full LEA full-time virtual school. Students in this subset represented 37% of all virtual enrollments and had a virtual pass rate of 53%. There were, however, important differences observed in the non-virtual performance of MVS and local students. So it should be clear by now that when we got the record, we had the record of what they took online and what they were taking in their building. MVS students passed their non-virtual courses 93% of the time, whereas students in the local subset only passed their non-virtual courses 75% of the time. Students taking MVS courses made up 10% of the virtual learning population. This group totaled 4% of virtual enrollments and had an overall virtual pass rate of 81%. Students in the local virtual subset accounted for 72% of virtual learners and tallied 59% of the virtual enrollments. Their pass rate was 59%. Virtual pass rates varied when considering a student's non-virtual performance. Virtual learners with at least 3 non-virtual courses were classified into one of 3 categories based on their success in their non-virtual courses. The 3 categories were passed all the non-virtual courses that we had on record for them, they did not pass 1 or 2 of the non-virtual courses, or they did not pass 3 or more of the non-virtual courses. In total, 65% of students had at least 3 or more non-virtual enrollments, and of that group, 47% passed all their non-virtual courses, 23% did not pass 1 or 2, and 30% did not pass 3 or more. There were clear differences in the virtual pass rate between those 3 categories. Students passing all of their non-virtual courses had an 84% virtual pass rate. Students who did not pass 1 or 2 of their non-virtual courses, they had a pass rate of 60%. Those with the lowest non-virtual success had a virtual pass rate of only 37%. There were also differences for these 3 groups by virtual subset. Students taking MVS courses consistently had higher virtual pass rates, 89%, 76%, 52% respectively, compared to those who were using their local virtual solution, which is 83%, 59%, 37% respectively. There were slightly more females enrolled in virtual courses than males, though from a percentage perspective, each represented 50% of the population. I think we were within 400 students, something like that. For the 4 highest enrollment subject areas, the proportion of enrollments for males and females within those subject areas was within 1% of each other. Females had a 3% higher virtual pass rate, 59% compared to 56%, continuing the trend we've seen in past years of females outperforming their male counterparts on this measure. And I haven't seen anything in the chat yet, but I'm guessing that a lot of the people are nodding their heads. In English language and literature, females had a 3% higher pass rate than males, 2% higher for mathematics, 3% higher for life and physical sciences, and 4% higher for social sciences and history. 54% of virtual learners were classified as living in poverty. This is about 8% higher than the K-12 statewide average of students eligible for free or reduced lunch in the fall of 2015. Students living in poverty took 61% of the virtual enrollments for the year. This is 1% lower than the percentage of virtual enrollments for students in poverty in the 2014-15 school year. The pass rate for students in poverty was 12 percentage points lower than students who were not in poverty. This gap was the same size observed in the previous year. In addition to the performance gap between those in poverty and those not in poverty, there were also differences in non-virtual pass rates. Virtual learners in poverty had a 70% pass rate in their non-virtual courses, which is a 17% improvement over their virtual pass rate. Interestingly, students not in poverty had an 86% pass rate, which is a 21% improvement over their virtual pass rate. Thus, students in poverty actually had a smaller performance gap between their virtual and non-virtual pass rates than did the students who were not in poverty. White students made up 66% of the virtual students, with African American students totaling the second highest percentage at 19%. Pass rates range between a low of 51% for African American students to a high of 69% for Asian students. State assessment data on SAT and MSTEP was used to provide an independent measure of student performance. Based on those measures on data from students in 11th grade, virtual learners showed lower percentages reaching proficiency on the evidence-based reading and writing from SAT, the mathematics from SAT, the science from the MSTEP, and social studies from the MSTEP. The examinations that the statewide on their statewide proficiency rates. About half of the 11th grade virtual learners tested proficient in reading and writing, and about a quarter were proficient in mathematics or science. As would be expected, the percentage of virtual learners testing proficient on these state tests varied considerably when taking into account their non-virtual performance. For instance, students taking a minimum of 3 non-virtual courses and passing all of them had proficiency rates that exceeded the statewide average for each of the 4 tests. Students who did not pass 1 or 2 of their non-virtual courses, and those not passing 3 or more of their non-virtual courses, they had much lower rates of proficiency. Students in poverty consistently recorded proficiency rates that were 20 to 30% lower on the standardized measures than the peers who were not in poverty. A similar gap, though not as big, was found with students based on their seat time waiver status. Students with seat time waiver, which is a waiver that adjusts the requirement for the student to be physically in attendance at the school facility and lifts the cap on the number of virtual courses that can be taken away from the school, made up 17% of the virtual learners. A quarter of the virtual enrollments were from students on a seat time waiver. The actual course pass rate for those students with a seat time waiver was 56% compared to those without a 58%. Those are pretty comparable. However, students with a seat time waiver were 10% to 16% less likely to reach proficiency on the state tests than those without a waiver. Students taking virtual courses with MVS, the Michigan Virtual School, had the highest rate of proficiency on the 4 tests, exceeding the state average on all 4 examinations. Students from the local virtual subset had rates that were higher than those from cyber and full-time virtual programs. If we consider the non-virtual performance of students, the MVS students consistently outperformed the local virtual solution by double digits. One of my personal favorite parts of the report each year are the Michigan maps we generate. The map on this slide shows the percentage of non-cyber school students in each ISD area that took at least one virtual course in the 2015-16 school year. The darker the blue, the higher the percentage of virtual students. Berrien, Eastern Upper Peninsula, Gogebic-Ontonagon, St. Joseph, Tuscola, and West Shore ISDs had more than 10% of their student populations taking a virtual course in 2015-16. Since cyber schools do not really have their own resident district, but rather they draw students from other districts to attend their schools, this map shows where the cyber school students are actually located. The darker the orange, the higher percentage of cyber school students. Students who are residents of Wayne, Oakland, Macomb, Genesee, Ingham, and Kent ISDs made up the highest percentage of cyber school students in the state for the 2015-16 school year. This year's report represents the 6th year of data on the effectiveness of virtual learning in Michigan's K-12 system. Over the 6 years of data, we've seen the number of virtual learners grow from over 36,000 to over 90,000. We've seen the number of virtual enrollments grow from just shy of 90,000 to over 453,000 enrollments. The number of schools with virtual learning grew from around 650 to now over 1,000 schools. As I mentioned earlier on, I think it's worth keeping in mind the TSDL change, that the change from moving that as a requirement to report on all students to the requirement of just reporting on special populations, which included virtual learners. It seems likely that this change played a role in changing the trajectories of these three charts. The flat trend for virtual pass rate has continued. The high water mark of 66% lasted for only the first year, and since that time has fluctuated pretty close to 60% for the last 5 years. Despite that, many trends witnessed in past years continue to exist. The data clearly indicated that students can and do succeed with virtual learning. Over half of virtual learners passed all of their virtual courses. Over a quarter of schools with virtual learning had school-wide pass rates of 90% to 100%. Yet many kids, too many kids, had little to no success with virtual learning. A quarter of students did not pass any of their virtual courses. Over 2,000 of those students took 11 or more virtual courses in the year, and in general, the overall virtual pass rate for the year was 58%. The data in this report represent an opportunity for schools and educational stakeholders to have critical conversations about what's working and for whom it's working, and what's not working and under what circumstances those results are occurring. MVU has created many resources that can assist schools in reflecting upon and improving their virtual programs. Some of these resources include our student guide to online learning. This guide is aimed at middle and high school students who are thinking about taking a virtual course. The guide shares advice and recommendations from virtual instructors, mentors, and virtual students. Our parent guide to online learning. This guide is written for parents and guardians of students thinking about taking a virtual course, but it's also relevant to other adults, such as school counselors. The guide contains helpful information to assist with the decision-making process. And Mentor Fundamentals. All Michigan public school students taking virtual courses are expected to have a mentor assigned to them. The mentor is an employee of the school district that the student attends and acts as a critical on-site support for the student. This guide helps mentors better understand the role of mentoring and includes recommended practices for supporting students. All three of these guides and other practical resources are available on the MVU website. Thank you for taking the time out of your really busy schedules to learn about the findings published in Michigan's K-12 Virtual Learning Effectiveness Report for the 2015-16 school year. It's really been my pleasure to spend this time with you, and want to open it up now for questions that people have.
Joe, I think one of the questions that Christopher posed um, is really important, and I think something that our team discusses here a lot too, right? So, what can we do with this data to try to improve some of the flat trends that we've seen around performance rates, and what are we doing as a state? What are we doing as an organization? What are schools doing to try to address some of those concerning trends?
Yeah, well, that is kind of a question I get quite often. Um, Christopher, I don't know if you know about Michigan. Michigan actually has a required graduation requirement. Students have to take an online learning experience in order to graduate from our state. Now, what that looks like can vary from one district to another, or probably even one school to another within a district. But um, the way that I kind of tackle it and the way I see this in this data are that there are kids who are successful and have the ability to perform quite well in these virtual courses. As you saw the statistic, about half of the kids pass everything you give them. Really, one of the big challenges is in that middle bucket of those students who are having mixed success, or that kind of large bucket of students who are not having any success. And some of them are having a lot of opportunity for failure. That question of like, why would you give 2,800 students 11 plus opportunities for failure without implementing something else is, I think, an important policy question for schools to be asking themselves, and also a supports question. What are the supports that are being provided? Some of those resources that we provided in the last slide about the student guide, the parent guide, the mentor guide, they get at all kinds of aspects. They get at aspects like the recruiting. Who are you seeing as students who are ready for an online experience at that time? How are you supporting them? How are you having communications with their parents about the ways that they need to support those students as well, such that they get through the process and have success and develop that skill set to become more of that independent and individualized learner. One of the stats I don't believe I shared in here, but one of the things we find is that students who take fewer virtual courses tend to be more successful. And so I'll describe this a little bit as a curve. So if you're taking 1 or 2 virtual courses, you tend to score better than if you take 3 or 4, than if you take 5 or 6. So that kind of is just sloping down. And then when you get on the other side of 5 or 6, it starts to arc back up. You can handle 6 or 7, 7 or 8, 8 or 9, and it starts to come back over. But this area in between, when a student's attention is split between part of what they have to do to get through their online courses and part of what they have to do to get through their face-to-face courses, seems to be a challenging area for many students. And so dropping kids who have no experience online to a huge onslaught of virtual courses at any one given time tends not to be recommended practice for us. Trying to help them get their feet wet with 1 or 2 courses tends, based on the data I've been looking at, seems to be a better suggestion there. So Diane, your question was, does it depend on the reason for the virtual courses? Are credit recovery courses more or less successful? Well, here's what I'll say. There was no flag. We don't collect in the state data the enrollment reason, but we were able to parse out, for instance, Diane, that notion of the general education schools versus the alternative education schools. So I guess I would say one of the things that I like about this report is it allows you to benchmark against your peers. You probably have your own target goals about where you want to be, but you can also compare yourself based on this report about where you are in comparison with others. The data that we saw out of this was that the virtual pass rate for general education schools was about 62%, and alternative education schools was about 49%. So if you were dealing with an alt program, what might be the closest benchmark for your credit recovery, I'd be looking for programs that were at least as good as that 49 or 50%. If I was serving a population that didn't tend to have a lot of credit recovery, was more in that general education space, I'd be looking for a completion rate of at least 62% or higher if possible. Okay, Christopher, your question is, these online courses students taking, are they on or off timetable? Do the students work at home, or is there scheduled time at the school? It would vary. A lot of schools do not have labs that the kids can go to. They may provide a space in something like a library or a cafeteria. Some schools have fabulous labs. They have 5 or 6 mentors that may float around and help students within those labs. It really just depends on how the school uses their funding, how well funded they are, and how much of a priority they place on these options. But oftentimes there is something at the school because of that mentoring activity that they can do it from the school, and most often they have access to their courses away from school as well. Okay, Christopher, your question was, why does each student need to take a virtual class? Is it a cost savings? I think if you talk to districts, they'd say no, it's cost additive. But the policy rationale behind that was really that in order to graduate college and career ready, in fact, we've had it for over 10 years now. It went into effect in 2006. Really, to be able to be that kind of global citizen, to be able to really be college and career ready, there was a belief that you needed to have the ability to start learning online, that was an essential characteristic and trait. So it really wasn't around the money, it was more around the philosophy of what it takes to be prepared for today's world. Class size regulations. How many students does a teacher have? The state of Michigan doesn't specify are there class size regulations for the virtual courses. It does in many cases, like in our Michigan is a course choice state, and by that it means that parents and students can elect to take an online course, even if that course is provided locally face-to-face. In that sense, there has to be a Michigan certified, highly qualified teacher who would teach that course. And those kinds of courses are going to tend to have smaller class sizes. There are some other, let's just call them more skills-based software that exist particularly in the credit recovery space. And in those cases, those fit under that digital learning virtual program that we were talking about, where there's not a teacher coming through and they may have a lot of students in one of those. It may be overseen in a lab environment by a parapro or a certified teacher who kind of helps and moves them through those lab settings. So some full-time teachers have 200 students, while others have may have 400 students. I think part of it also really depends on what's the expectations of the teachers. Are the teachers producing content? Some courses there, in some providers, teachers' role is very much intensive in terms of producing course content for their students, and others not so much. How much do they grade? That depends on the level of auto grading within a course. If students are submitting work and it's kind of churned back to them in a quick time by the system, and the students don't have those commitments, then maybe what they're spending more of their time on is focused feedback to the students. In such case, they might be able to handle bigger loads. It really just depends a lot on the interaction between what the technologies are doing and what the teacher's role is within those systems. Yeah, thanks, Justin, for mentioning Chin-C's work. Well, Justin, I know we're getting kind of close to wrapping it up. I'm happy to stay online and see if there are any other chat questions that come through. Let me just advance the slide and let you close us up.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe, for that incredibly comprehensive look at the state of online learning here in Michigan. We do encourage everyone to go and check out the full text of the report to do an even deeper dive into that data, and feel free to reach out to us with questions that you have about the report and the data. Just a couple other housekeeping items before we wrap up. We do have a couple initiatives that we want to make mention of here. We do have a podcast series called Virtual Viewpoints, which you can listen to my lovely voice a little bit more if you're so inclined. And you can hear from folks all around the country who are doing work in virtual learning, doing work in online and blended learning, and how they're using research to inform their work. So we encourage you to check out our podcast series as well as our guest blogger program. If there are folks out there who would like to share their own research, whether it is in progress, if they're looking to get feedback on their research, check out our guest blogger program to see if you might be a good fit to write for our blogging platform. We also want to make mention of our webinar next week, April 26th at 2 p.m. We'll be hosting a webinar with Quality Matters, which is an organization that does a lot of work around ensuring quality in online courses. We're going to talk through the partnership that MVU and QM have and go a little bit over how there could be some opportunities for Michigan-based practitioners to use Quality Matters in their own setting. So we encourage you to check us out next Wednesday at 2 p.m. as well. And lastly, we just encourage you to keep in touch with us. If you have feedback for us about our webinar series or about any of our work, email us at mvlri@mivu.org. You can sign up for our mailing list, which is linked here. Actually, I don't know if that's linked since Joe's sharing his screen, but I'll be sure to put the link in the chat window if you're so inclined to keep in touch with us. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, our YouTube channel, where you can see the recording of this webinar and all of our archived webinars. This webinar will be up probably in the next day or so, so go and share with all of your colleagues who might find it valuable. And you can check out all of the upcoming webinars that we have on our schedule at our website at mvlri.org/presentations/webinars. With that, I will wrap us up. Want to wish everyone a great rest of your week. Thank you so much for joining us, and take care.